before, and I think that this contribution will be very important for our research. And there are several questions I would like to question you about it. One of that is this coming back to the Bacchus. I was wondering if those art historians who told about senses, touching, seeing, there is something, maybe something true in that, and there is in my mind a sort of strange gap between being touched and not only touched but really beat by the lézard and the moment of seeing and making this gesture, a sort of non-immediate connection between the two, or acceleration, or maybe in some other painting a real gap. And that's one of the of the device of Bernard. One of Bernard's work we was talking last spring. But maybe he will explain it if he wants. But it's one of the problems that interest us, because if touching is supposed to be the more direct sense to grasp reality, to grasp real. Maybe this painting is always saying something about this illusion in the relation between to touch and to see, something I cannot really explain, but a sort of interrogation about how faithful could be the senses and how rapid could be the mind to make something with the sensation.
Yeah, no, that's wonderful. I want to think more about it, but what's the picture that would be, if I had it, it would be really interesting to see, is the incredulity of Thomas in Potsdam. So there's this fantastic painting of Caravaggio's in which we see it's like half-length figures. Right? Caravaggio loves that format. It's like the martyrdom of St. Ursula. The figures are cut off. And we have Christ at the left, the risen Christ, and his chest is bare, and we see the wound. And then there are 4 disciples. One, boom, 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 and their heads make a kind of diamond. And the one nearest Christ is Thomas. No, 3 disciples. Boom, 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 and then the head of Christ. The 4 of them make the 4 heads here, something like that. Anyway, Christ has taken Thomas's hand, and he puts his finger in the wound, which is bloodless. We don't see any blood. But we see the finger go right into the wound. Christ looks down as he pushes it in. And then there's this expression on Thomas's face, which is a kind of wonder. And the brilliant idea of the picture, I think, I mean, Caravaggio is just always so brilliant at rethinking subjects. So here, if you say, what is the expression on Thomas's face, and you ask yourself, I mean, the basic idea, right, of the Thomas probing the wound is, it's as if he sees the wound, but he doesn't believe that this is Christ, or that Christ is really risen. So he then touches the wound, and the touching gives him belief. The touching gives him conviction. But in the Caravaggio picture, his expression of amazement makes you think that whatever he thought at first, the touching, I mean, if he had touched with his eyes shut, it wouldn't have been enough. It's like now the seeing makes him believe that the touching is real. You see what I mean? It's as if, in the end in this picture, it's like the seeing beats the touching, because so that's the brilliance of the interpretation, that this extraordinary touching needed the supplément of vision. So this would be on the side of what you're saying.
So I have more question, but I can wait. So I make another question and then. Michael, do you do anything with this? This seems to be a fact that Caravaggio take real people as models and put them in the paintings.
Yeah.
I was thinking to your Jeff Wall chapter and what Jeff Wall say about quasi-reportage, and when he explained what he do, it is quite similar in a sense. He say I take people who are in pose, but they are people who was used to do what they do in the painting, in the photograph. There is a quasi reportage. It's not a snapshot. It's a construction, but people who are in the painting are real maybe workers, for example. And he said, Jeff Wall said that he was influenced by Italian neorealism cinema. This is where we start from, me and Bernard, this seminar, maybe 7 years ago, to look at bodies in those films from Rossellini and Pasolini, where the same occurs. People, not professional actors, but people that carry something of their bodies in the film. And my question is, do you make something of that in your Caravaggio?
Yeah, I mean, there are several things. I mean, there's been very interesting Caravaggio scholarship the last 20 or 30 years. There's been interesting work on a number of fronts. One front has to do with the question of patronage and the people who supported Caravaggio. So we know 1,000,000 times more than we did. And it changes the picture that we have of Caravaggio, to know that he's living in a palace and receives all this support. But another thing that there's been a tremendous amount of, in a way, interesting writing about, or important writing about, I'm thinking above all of Keith Christensen at the Met, has to do with the use of models. That Caravaggio, in his own time, it's part of the criticism against Caravaggio, or shortly after him. A number of the earliest people who write about Caravaggio write about him negatively. And they say, well, you know, it's not the Magdalene, it's just a girl from the street who he brings into the studio and pretends is the Magdalene and so on, and it doesn't have any real emotional force, it's just, and then, so that's a negative criticism. Then you get the whole massive wave of writing about Caravaggio in the 20th century, which you could say rightly, but maybe a little simplistically, emphasizes the spiritual depth of the pictures. So let's say then if people start writing about the Magdalene, they'll say, well, but his genius is to take this ordinary woman, or ordinary girl, and show her at this moment of realizing the vanity of her life, and it's her simplicity, and it's just profoundly, deeply moving. Caravaggio just gets at spiritual depths that no one ever got to before. And there's a tremendous amount of writing like that. And it's not that you want to say that that's just wrong, but it then but it doesn't sort of do anything. I mean, that is to say, it's just like, oh, he's really good at doing spiritual depth. And, you know, no one ever did such spiritual depth before, and now he just does spiritual depth. There's no, as my former teacher, Sidney Friedberg, says, there is no question of the psyche that he cannot probe. But, I mean, that doesn't, that's sort of like naming a particular effect, but it's not at all suggesting how something's actually done. Then there's been a sort of movement at the same time of really emphasizing the use of models. And one reason for that is people have become increasingly aware that in various of his paintings, there are little incised lines that Caravaggio made in the wet paint, you know, either with the back end of his brush or with some other little instrument. So it would go and when they then try to figure out why are there these incised lines, the feeling is it was almost certainly because he's working from models. And he makes those marks as a kind of indication that will stay in the picture while he's working on it, of where the models were in their pose. So if they have to take a break or come back the next day, he can get them into approximately the right position because he's got these little scrape marks in the pictures. Okay? So that's been a whole other way of like forcing the issues of the use of models. And we also then become aware of, you know, Artemisia Gentileschi serves as a model for herself, also probably serves as a model for her father. All of these are very loaded issues at the time. So, and you even get the question today of, you know, people being bothered because various paintings by Caravaggio don't seem really emotionally that realistic. But that's probably because he used models. There's a whole confused discussion about this. And so I talk about this I think it's very, very important that he's using models. I think he's absolutely content for the use of models to be seen, right? And you see that very clearly in the Caravaggisti, right? So these are real issues, and it's very central to his realism, I think, that it's a realism that acknowledges something about how it got made, as opposed to just trying to present one with, you know, like the illusion that this is really Mary or Christ or whatever. It's much, so yes, I do, I mean, I don't know if that answers what you're saying, but I do talk about that. I do talk about that. And with the Caravaggisti, it's absolutely inescapable too. So, it's almost as if with various paintings of Caravaggio's, take the Judith and Holofernes and the Barberini. You know, people will say, well, you sense how awkward it was for this young girl to hold the sword. You know, they don't quite want to say you sense how awkward it was for her to cut the head off, because they're aware that she probably wasn't really cutting the head off some other model. But nevertheless, they're aware of what feels like a kind of awkwardness. And the suggestion is almost like it would be better if that awkwardness weren't there, you know. And that's that's where it gets crazy. I mean, it's an unbelievably amazing picture. And the fact that you sense that something was done in a studio, you know, that the Caravaggio's paintings return you to the studio and return you to the making of the picture. It's very few people have made themselves comfortable with that. I mean, Dempsey has, Cropper has, Keith Christensen has, but lots of the commentators haven't. But yes, I think that's a real issue. You know, Caravaggio is making paintings that not always, but often announce how, you know, something about how they got made, and how they got made involved models. And then some of the Caravaggisti just take this very, very far.
Excuse me.
I would like to come back on this question of temporality about the self-portrait, or the question of self-portrait.
The question
of self-portrait.
Uh-huh.
When you're saying about the question Giovanni was making about feeling, seeing, and this several terms of time, it's different ways of time, and somehow you need a feedback of the seeing, about the feeling, and this kind about the touch, and this kind of double times somehow on the several times level. But there's something else that seems very interesting to me in your lecture today, is that when Caravaggio is exchanging the pencil with another kind of tool or a gesture that has any tool, so that he's showing, that he's holding the head, or that when you're speaking about it, you speak about how he's holding the pencil and how he's holding with his left hand his color palette. He has to make a change, a very important change in the drawing of the figure, because the figure is no more holding a pencil, he's holding a head. And there is something very interesting about time in this, because this suggestion that he is painting himself in a gesture of creating, and then he's able to transform these gestures in another one, holding a head, is something that is a construct much more, gives, your interpretation gives somehow a much more importance to the gesture as something that is construct at the same time that it contains at the same time the figure of the painter himself. I mean a figure in the sense of something that has memory, a gesture that has memory of another gesture before. And this perspective of gestures, one in another, and time one in another, seems to me very important, because we are entering in this gap of the moment, of the feeling. We are opening now a perspective, a very large feeling of time with several walls that are falling. The more you feel this, no?
Yeah,
So it seems to me a very question of figure.
Mm-hmm.
That's why I was talking about figure.
Mm-hmm. No, I think I agree.
Mm-hmm.
In the outcoming of photography, and for example, we have the example of a painter who would be an antithesis to Courbet and Manet, that would be 𝙁𝙁𝙢𝙥𝙯, for example, who wanted to continue to paint the paintings as precise and as realistic as possible, but not realistic in the sense that you have explained, realistic in the sense that you would have denied for 𝙁𝙁, to continue to be realistic and to resist to photography. And my question would be, would you place either Courbet or Manet within a photographic moment of painting in 19th century, in the sense that either Courbet with Le Désespéré would have invented something like the gros plan that would be something cinematographic or photographic that wouldn't have been possible to think of without the arrival of photography, or maybe it's not at all a photographic problem or a symptom, or either Manet with what you call facingness, because in photography obviously you always come somehow to facingness because you have someone in front of you. Is either Courbet or Manet, I mean Courbet with the body and Manet with facingness, somehow concerned with the photography, or would you say no?
Let's start with Manet. The answer would be absolutely yes. I mean, but with Manet, photography is absolutely one element in his thinking. Right. By the time Manet comes along, we're in the 1860s. We have the carte de visite. We have technology reaches a certain point. It's not instantaneous yet. But Manet is clearly interested in it, aware of it, and so on. And when I wrote my book on Manet, one of the questions that I sometimes when you're doing a book, as opposed to an essay, there'll be things at some point you realize, well, if I'm doing the book, I've got to have something to say about this and this, because they become part of the discussion. But for a long while, you may not know what it is you want to say, but you know you better have something, because you can't just avoid them. And the two things with Manet like that were photography and Japanese prints, because we know that Manet was very involved with Japanese prints. And to make a long story short, in the book on Manet, at a certain moment, it seemed to me, I realized, he's treating photography as if it was Japanese prints, and he's treating Japanese prints as if it was photography. I mean, part of the brilliance is to use prints to interpret photography and photography to interpret prints. What do I mean? Photography at that moment can't yet be instantaneous, right? You sense the duration of the pose. But in a Japanese print, you get a certain sense of, shock. On peut frapper. So and at the same time, in a Japanese print, there isn't the same sense of the real. And it's not black and white, it's not sharp value contrast, but he brings that from photography. So you suddenly get the presence, the simultaneous presence of Japanese prints in photography in his painting in a way that really matters. So yeah, I think the photography. In Courbet's case, Courbet is certainly aware of photography. And there are certain paintings of his where you really can feel, he even would have had certain photographs of nudes, especially his bathers in Montpellier. Feels like it doesn't help him, but it feels like he's been looking at photographs of nudes. And he may have even had a photograph of a nude that bears a relation to the nude in the studio, but then what he does with it is, completely different. So it's hard to say, but photography is certainly part of the story. It's not, I don't think, I mean, the traditional idea that somehow once photography came, painting was free to do other things, On the one hand, photography could do realism better than painting, and then painting got liberated to become abstract painting. I think that's, I just don't believe that. I think that's much too simple. I think there's a much more, constant back and forth between photography and painting. You see it very clearly, say, in Tai Buck. But I think, yes, for both Courbet and Manet, there's an interest. Photography is part of the visual culture that they're interested in.
But if you let me put it in another way, I wanted you to choose, if you agree to choose, would you say that the relation between painting and photography is more on the side of the phenomenological weight of the body within the image, like Courbet, or more on the side of facingness with Manet?
As always, I think it varies. I mean, I'm always going to want to not go a fixed route. Okay? I'm always going to want to say, look, you have to look at the particular instances and see. Put another way, I want to resist the idea that there is a kind of abstract essence of photography. Just like that there's an abstract essence of painting, I want to say that at any given moment you have to look and see how it works. So that's why I'd say photography has it in it to in different ways do both. It can't do the body and phenomenology to the extent that, and texture to the extent that painting can. Jeff Wall says somewhere, the eros of painting is touch. And at one point I quote Thomas Demand. Demand and I were standing together in the Alte National Gallery in Berlin. And we were looking at this stupendous breaking wave painting of Courbet's. It's the greatest of all his breaking waves. And the paint in it is incredible, and the sheer weight of the water is incredible. And you feel the spray in your face, and you feel the stones moving under your feet. It's just overwhelming painting. And Miro says at one point in a conversation in the Louvre of the breaking wave well, it was then the Louvre, now it would be Orsay. And it's a great picture, but it's not as great as the one in Berlin. And Miro says, you feel it even when your back is to it in the room. You feel it. And Damon, we were looking at this breaking wave, and Damon, and we were, the paint and the heaviness and the water, and Damon said, that is what we cannot do. And I think that's true. I think there's a limitation on photography with respect to texture, bodiliness, weight, and so it can go very, very far. But of course, but then there are things, you know, again and again and again. In that book, I'm talking about the way in which it's photography that lets this artist and that artist and that artist do what he or she does. You know, Luke's photographs, if you imagine them made by a painter, or even like it's as close to identical as possible. If you knew they were paintings, they would not function the same way. They wouldn't have anything like the same ontological character. And that's just true again and again and again. So, but for me, it's always a matter of looking at the specific instances to see what it is that, you know, that does this. Rather than wanting to define an essence. Okay? I don't want to go that way. This partly has to do with feeling that I always want to feel that I'm thinking historically. Right? And thinking historically means not thinking with an a priori, and thinking that you have to look at a particular instance in order to figure out what's going on. You have to look and see. And then sometimes you have to do more than look and see. You have to sort of, you know, read and recontextualize and think about it and so on. So, anyway, that's a long answer.
Thank you.
But, you know, photography is part of the story of painting from the minute it gets invented, you know, and even from a little bit before. It's just entre les lignes.
I've got a question. Like, I don't know if we can see the painting, maybe it's not necessary, but I wanted to ask you something about the low part of the painting you focused on. So on this Caravage, on this ragazzo morso dal ramarro, the boy beaten by
The lizard.
Yes. Because one of the, I think one of the effect, very astonishing effect of your interpretation is that you look at the picture in a completely different way. I mean, you focus not on the referential idea of the autoportrait. No? Is he Caravaggio, yes or no? I mean, thinking of the real person, was he really there?
Yeah.
And so on, which is a very, I mean, it's in a way, it is a way which has been absolutely the main way. On the other side, I think well, it's evident, you just think of the autoportrait as the inscription in the text itself, or painting itself, of this act of enunciation, let's say, of a sort of representation of the act of doing itself. And you going back to Courbet was very interesting, no? Because you find these figures of the very different things, round things, which are linked to the hand, which is in theory holding the palette. So going through this Courbet and going back to Caravaggio, of course, one of the things you question is what's going on near the hand, which in a way should be holding this very particular thing which has got colors. A color will be put on a painting, will go together, will fond, will make figures and so on. There is a sort of una caraffa, we say in Italian, so like a glass
This vase, yeah.
And I was thinking of
with brilliant reflections and refractions in it. Yeah.
Because I was thinking if it was just a matter of reflection, because when, for example, Poussin, the autoportrait of Poussin, which is like, as you said, a different stage of the whole theory, etc. He has got a little diamond on his ring, and Louis Marin points out, in a way that you don't forget afterwards, that it's, what is a diamond? It's a little device of dividing colors. Now, in a way, light goes into and it divides it. So I was wondering, how do you think of this round form of this carafe, of this thing? If you think it just as a matter of reflection, which is very common in the 16th century painting and the end of 15th century, or if you also think of this thing of dividing the color and this position near to the end, if it can be thought of as something of an anticipation of what Poussin does in a very conceptual way. And then I was also thinking of the little beast, which in Italian is ramarro. And I was thinking, I don't know, I have no answer, but is it a little beast that changes its color?
I'm like a chameleon.
I don't know, because I think it's, I mean, there is a camaleonte which is, it just does this in his life, that it changes its form according to what's around. It's very mimetic, so it's a very painting device, let's say. But I was wondering of a ramarro, because there is something which is linked to color with this little beast in Italian, I guess, because it's, but I can't say. So I wanted your opinion. If you can go further with your analysis, I think it's just out because.
That's wonderful. I want to think about it. I have to say, it never occurred to me anything about the division of color there. I mean, I think that in the book I have I reproduce the vase, the detail, and the flowers, and I talk about the way the reflection works and how much it makes us conscious of the cadre.
Of this one?
Of the cadre. You know, that it's a way of, because one of the whole things about the Caravaggio dispositif, and then it's going to become basic to this whole moment of painting, is to make one aware of the limits of the picture and what lies beyond the limits. And that something lies beyond the limits that's, one, not part of the picture, but two, essential to the making of the picture. So, insofar as we're making the gallery picture, it's cut out against what lies outside. But it all takes place in something like a studio. It involves a dispositif that's necessary in order to make this autonomous picture. There has to be this other stuff in place. And that reflection contributes very much to the sense of that. And so if there's anything it would be almost allegorized, would be the importance of the cadre to the inside, but in a way that nevertheless cuts it as outside. You see what I mean? It's like both things. And that, I think, you get again and again in Caravaggio. So that, I mean, there may well be more that one could do with the color, but that's what fascinates me about the use of the reflection. It brings the outside into play, but in a way that still marks it as outside. Yeah.
I have a question. I think it's from I'm speaking. I think I lack a lot of knowledge, so I make too big theories. It has to be small down, so I ask you to apologize. It's the size of what I'm telling, but when you spoke at the beginning of the tableau chez Diderot, it was of course the conception of the tableau for Diderot, but I think there is another obvious conception of the tableau which is built by the perspective. And I think it's also what is behind the tableau, but what is also in front of the tableau. For instance, Pascal told about de l'idée derrière la tête, because of the reflection point, so there is something happened there. And absolutely, by all what you said, I believe in it, and I think I'm convinced by it. And what I'm thinking is maybe there is something like, which is behind it, that the perspective doesn't interest people anymore, or it's so obvious that we don't want to talk about it, but it's still there, and of course perspective is still working with demonstration, and so there is still demonstration there behind that which is not spectacular enough, or I don't know, we don't want to deal with it, and so there is something always behind or around, stuck to the frame, working. Comme quelque chose comme du refoulé.
Repressed.
Yes, repressed. Yes. You think it's?
I mean, it's you know, I think that's extremely interesting, and the question would be what you could do with it. One way of thinking of the tableau for Diderot, you know, is he really, for him it is essentially lateral. Essentially, comes up. You know, it's in this plane. So that, you could say, minimizes the perspective. You know, it makes, there has to be perspective, but the issue for him is like that. So it would be a matter of demonstrating, again, in terms of specific works and works that he deals with, that there is something like a repressed working of perspective that somehow is a condition of possibility of this laterality. That would be how you would have to define the project. And you know, it's possible you could do it. I have no impulse to say that could not be done. Yes. You know, by the time we get to Poussin, it's then perspective is, you know, massively in play, and precisely in ways that, you know, various people, but certainly Dempsey and Cropper have both talked about it a lot.
On a tous parlé du mauvais anglais, mais si c'est la langue qui fait obstacle aux questions, n'hésitez pas à bien penser, sinon ça part d'autres questions, on peut aussi commencer à penser.
On peut aussi reposer jusqu'à demain.
Donc on laisse encore 30 secondes de silence. Moi, j'avais peut-être une dernière question sur le Courbet. Tu as présenté vraiment comme presque une immersion du peintre dans son propre tableau. Si tu pouvais revenir un instant sur ce qui arrive au deuxième spectateur, c'est-à-dire
Yeah, so in the Courbet book, I do, I mean, my reading of the burial, the L'Enterrement, I don't have that to show you, but that's a very, in a way that has never been seen, was never seen. It's a very complexly structured painting. Right? The assumption has always been that the burial was about as complicated as a baguette, or say like a baguette cut into a lot of slices. And so it's like one thing after another, right? And that's even been taken as a kind of paradigm of realism. You could even say realism equals metonymy equals one thing next to another equals a baguette cut into a whole lot of different slices, and that's what you see in the burial. In fact, the burial is incredibly sophisticated construction in all sorts of ways. Just to take the most obvious thing, which is a perspective issue, the grave in the very center of the enterrement is shown from an angle. I mean, you feel that the grave is parallel to the picture surface, but it's as if it's seen from over to the left of the center of the picture, because we aren't shown the grave head on. We are shown it, and again, if I had a blackboard, I could draw it. So, but it doesn't matter. But so, in other words, there's a point de vue. In a sense, there are two implicitly something like 2 points of view. One is the central point of view, and then there's a point of view over to the left, from which the projection of the grave looks correct. But the minute you move to the left, you also realize that you're in front of the porte-quoi, who is looking directly out at you. Something else is taking place there. And if you don't quite look back at the porte-quoi, but you look just a little tiny bit to the right, there is the head of Courbet's closest friend, Max Bouchon, who is at the end of the procession of the mourners, but in another sense is at the beginning, if you think of the projection into it, Max Bouchon from the... So it's as if there really are now suddenly two. I don't like points of view for Courbet because that suggests a kind of reculé. It's almost like two different points of no view. But two, and one I want to say is, this is his attempt to separate le peintre spectateur, from a painter beholder, from the beholder to whom. It's as if he's trying to make a separation in this picture. It's as if he's trying to figure out a way for the